Welcome to She Persisted. I'm your host, Sadie Sutton, a 19-year-old from the Bay Area studying psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. She Persisted is the teen mental health podcast made for teenagers by a teen. In each episode, I'll bring you authentic, accessible, and relatable conversations about every aspect of mental wellness. You can expect evidence-based teen-approved resources, coping skills, including lots of DBT, insights, and education in each piece of content you consume. She Persisted offers you a safe space to feel validated and understood in your struggle, while encouraging you to take ownership of your journey and build your life worth living. So let's dive in. This week on She Persisted.
One of my favorite phrases in psychology is, history is not destiny. Because no matter what has happened to this day in your life, that doesn't tell you where your life is going to go. We always have a choice. We always have that option in front of us that can be an inflection point in our lives, especially when we're going through a crisis.
Hello, and welcome to She Persisted. I'm so glad you're here. I am podcasting to you from the University of Pennsylvania campus. I just moved in. We started junior year 3 days ago and had our first 3 days of classes. We are going to be doing a Q&A and kind of junior year goals dump and update episode here soon. So I'm going to update you guys on all things related to this school year and just catch up with you very soon. But today's episode is one of my favorites that I've recorded on She Persisted. We have an incredible therapist and TikTok creator. His handle is at Your TikTok Therapist. You've definitely seen his videos. He has a community on TikTok of over 3 million followers, and his content is phenomenal. If you are ever struggling with being a teen, with your mental health, with emotions, with everything that comes with growing up and just navigating life, you need to follow this account and make sure you're getting these videos in your feed because he's hilarious. And it's also the best reminder that you're not alone with what you're experiencing. And so today we have Leandro Oshansky on the podcast. He is a psychotherapist with over 10 years of experience working in private practice. He specializes in depression, anxiety, relationship, and cultural ethnic issues. And he works with both teens and adults. So he has a really incredible understanding of what teens are struggling with these days from both the clients he's working with, but also this incredible community he's cultivated on TikTok. And so I got to pick his brain about all things TikTok, including the mental health side of TikTok, what teens are struggling with most, his advice for teens who are beginning their journey. We talked about persistence and resilience. We talked about changing your behaviors and thoughts and not trying to force changes onto your emotions and physiological reactions. Just so many incredible moments in this episode. I was so inspired. I was so hopeful. I absolutely loved this conversation, and I know you will as well. As always, if this resonates and is helpful, make sure to leave a review or share on social media. And if you share, tag at She Persisted Podcast, and I'll make sure to repost and give you a little shout out. But thank you guys for listening. I know you're going to love this episode as much as I did. And with that, let's dive in. Thank you so much for joining me today on She Persisted. I am so excited to have you on the show and to be able to sit down with you and pick your brain about so many relevant topics to teen mental health. To start things out for listeners who have seen your content but are not necessarily aware of your journey and your career, how did you start working in the mental health space and specifically really specializing in teens?
Well, so, I'm originally from Argentina. And one thing about Argentina that not many people know is that we have the most therapists per capita in the world. So we talk therapy, we are in conversations, just drop in things that we discuss with our therapist. So it is very much ingrained in society. So I've always, I grew up with it. And, when I was a teenager, my dad passed away and I developed a depression because of it. And I went to see a therapist. And she was great, right? And she helped me out tremendously. And at that point is when I started thinking, well, what if, right? What if I can be that person that helps the teenager or the adult sitting in front of you? So that's when the seed was planted. And, well, then I ended up moving here to the US, and the rest is history, I guess.
I love that. Before we dive into the next question, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on the United States and the mental health system, because it's obviously very different. We're still not at a point where mental health resources are readily available or extremely accessible. Are you feeling hopeful with the direction that we're moving, or where would you like to see improvements or see things
Yeah.
shifted, coming from having that context where therapy was so readily accessible and
Yeah.
there was a lot less barriers?
I am quite hopeful, and,
Yeah.
and part of my hope, comes from you guys,
Oh,
because the younger generation, they talk more openly about
yes.
the problems that they're facing, and so there's not that taboo of hey, I'm depressed or I'm anxious, right?
Yeah.
And that's great. So I think that push is coming from from the bottom up. I also see that the industry is making changes. For instance, I work with a lot of employers that offer 20, 25, 30 sessions for free to their employees.
That's
and
amazing.
and that's something that we didn't have before, right? So I'm all about meeting the client where the client is, and if the client doesn't have to pay for it, it's even better.
Yeah.
So I think we're making progress in that. I think therapists are given more importance these days as opposed to 5, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So I like the trajectory and the direction we're going with it.
That's really amazing to hear. And I completely agree, especially with how open and accepting Gen Z is with mental health. You sometimes are talking to like my parents or friends of parents, and just the reactions you get from saying similar things,
Mhm.
from talking to a teen and they're like, oh my gosh, yes, totally, I also struggle with my mental health, to an adult being like, did they just say that? It's
Yeah,
really incredible to know that you can be vulnerable about these things, and you'll
yeah,
have a positive reaction. People will be able to understand where you're coming from, and it's a very reassuring thing. And people are also very outspoken about wanting mental health support and
right.
wanting more resources, which is also
Absolutely.
really
One of
hopeful.
the downsides, I think, from our system here is that still healthcare is very much associated with a job, right?
Yes.
So some people, it is harder for them to have access to all type of resources, in particular
Yeah.
therapy, because maybe they don't have a full-time job, or their job doesn't offer benefits, or the copays might be way too high, or they
Yeah.
can't find a therapist that takes their insurance. There's a lot of barriers there, right? So I think that there's still a way to go. But
Yeah.
it's funny that you mentioned that people, especially younger people, are readily talking about issues, right? I had a gentleman a few weeks ago that he looking very strong, muscle tattooed, right? And not the typical person that you might see coming to therapy sometimes. It's changing, and I love that. And we did great work, and he was very happy. And he said, "Well, is there anything I can do to help you or help people in general?" And I said, "Well, when somebody asks, they're struggling, just share your story, right? Share that you did find help out there and that you're much better because of it." So
I
we
love
need to
that.
keep breaking stigma, even between men, that sometimes is so hard.
100%. I completely agree. As we're talking about kind of Gen Z and this younger demographic, I would love to hear your thoughts on going to therapy as a teen versus an adult. You've obviously worked with both demographics in your career, which I think gives you a really interesting perspective. And I know as a teen, it felt like there were so many things that adults didn't get about what I was experiencing, whether it felt
Hmm.
like I had less autonomy or that I wasn't in a position where I could really make changes in my life. What are the differences that you commonly see with teens versus adult when they're seeking therapy or even being told they have to go to therapy? Because that's
Yeah.
another element as a teen.
Right. Yeah. So unfortunately, you hear a lot of bad experiences of
Yeah.
kids that have been made to go to therapy, right?
Yeah.
And we never want to put, anybody really in that position that they're mandated to do therapy. But I think, kind of what we were talking earlier, teenagers are open, they're an open book, they tell you what's happening, they, they do perhaps have less autonomy, and there are things that they're not under their control as much as an adult, might have more control over their lives. So it is a delicate time when we are transitioning, towards adulthood. But in the end, I think that all patients, they want to feel heard and understood, and that's a commonality between the two groups. Once you understand the person sitting in front of you, you can empathize, you can understand where they're coming from and try to help. That's half the battle. If we can do that, you are studying psychology, so you know that the relationship between the therapist and the client is key, right? It's the most important variable that we may have. So if that's there, if the connection with your therapist is there, then we can do great things.
I completely agree. And I think for teens listening as well, I was in the same position where it was like, you have to go to therapy. I was being brought to therapy, but I wasn't the one initiating that journey or advocating for that resource. And the only thing that had to shift was for me to understand, like, this is my therapist, not my parents' therapist. And the therapist being really clear that they were like, it doesn't matter if your mom's like, let's talk about going to school and not leaving early. The therapist was like, this is about what you want to talk about. And this is about what is causing stress or anxiety or overwhelm in your life. And even if your parents do bring these things up or they want to talk to you about something, I'm first and foremost your therapist. And that means that I don't share things with them without consulting you first. And we're still not at a point where that's generally understood, that like if you go to therapy, there is that doctor-patient confidentiality. And just having that clarification as a teen was really helpful in being vulnerable.
Yeah. How old were you at the time, if you don't mind me asking?
I started therapy when I was 13. So I was really young. And it was that time in life where it was like, I was still believed everything was my parents' fault. So then when they were wanting me to go to therapy, it was like, no, I'm not going to go to therapy and have someone else get mad at me for all these things I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, it's something that I like to do when I have people that are there because someone is pushing them to be there, or sometimes they might be mandated, right? Because they have a DUI or something going on. One of the first things that I like to do is, okay, so you're here. You're mandated to be here. That sucks. So how are we going to use this time to benefit you, right? Now that you're here, let's make sure that we use this time in a way that you can benefit from.
Absolutely. I completely agree. The next thing that I wanted to ask you about is what you're seeing within the teen community, because you obviously have built an incredible community on TikTok, and TikTok is like an open book. People are commenting what problems they're having. They're asking questions about all these really specific things. And so you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I get the impression that you are likely picking on themes of teens are really stressed about back to school or transitioning to college or relationships or communication with parents. What are you seeing on TikTok and also in your practice in general about what teens are, above all else, struggling with, whether it's an emotion or a thought or a change in life, all of those things?
I think all of the above, right?
Yeah.
Anxiety clearly is something that has been present, in a way that we haven't seen before. So especially when COVID started, the amount of anxiety with teenagers, in particular teenage girls, right? They were removed from, their world, the group of friends, their activities, and their identity was attached a lot to those things. And it's been very difficult. So anxiety for sure, fears of the future. There's a lot of fear of getting old, fear of not living up to your potential. There's a lot of issues, communication with parents. Unfortunately, this is something that we haven't seen at this rate before. Progress is established by how quickly technology advances. And the amount of technological advances in these past 10, 20 years has been exponential. So it's almost as if kids are being brought up in a different world that the parents were. So there is a big disconnect, right, between those two different worlds. Maybe there's only 25, 30 years, in between, but they're a world away from each other. So that's very, very difficult sometimes to bridge, because teenager says, well, my parents don't get me, right? And the parents
Yeah.
say, man, they have everything. I don't know what they're complaining about. And we're not listening to each other. That's a problem. So we're not putting ourselves in the other person's shoes. Yeah, they don't have perhaps the necessities that you might have had growing up, but they have all of these other anxieties that also you didn't have growing up, right? So
Yeah.
if we could talk to each other a bit more, and especially hear each other, I think that things could go a lot smoother than they are sometimes.
What are your tips for teens and parents listening who are like, I do want to be vulnerable. I do want to start those conversations. And teens are wondering, like, how can I even say that to my parents? And then
Yeah.
parents are wondering, how do I even show my teen that I'm listening and that I appreciate that they're talking to me? What
Yeah.
would be your advice there for both parties?
Well, just to have that attitude is great, right?
Yeah.
So, and I've met a ton of great parents, and people that are willing to hear and listen, and get in tune with what's going on with their teenagers. I've always said that, delivering a message is is key. What is it that we are trying to communicate, and how can we try to make sure that the message arrives, right? So it's the basis of communication. If mom is, cooking and doing 100 things at a time, and we just come and say, mom, I think I'm depressed, and out of nowhere, then mom may say, yeah, you're not depressed, you're okay, right? And then it took perhaps, a lot for you to actually say that to mom, but it wasn't the right time. Mom was thinking of something different, and that message did not make it. So, and now there's a farther space between the two. So
Yeah.
finding the right time, I think it's important. I always say that if you tell your mom, hey mom, there's something that is really important to me that, when you have 2 minutes, I would love to sit down and talk about. Well, who, in their right mind as a parent will not hear that and say, okay, something's up, right?
Yeah.
I need to talk to my kid. So once that message did arrive, it's okay, now we can sit down and talk. Hopefully, we can even have this conversation outside of the regular routine. Maybe we can go for a walk. Maybe we can sit down and have coffee together. Maybe, we can find a different space in which communication will flow even better.
Yeah. I even think of like as a teen going to my parents and saying things like I'm struggling or I'm not doing well. And I sometimes wasn't even clear on what I wanted them to say or how I
Yeah.
wanted them to respond. And sometimes it was validation. I really needed them to say, I really see you're struggling and this is incredibly hard. And I just want you to know that I see that. Like that was all I
Yeah.
needed. And then there were other times where it was like I wanted them to say, thank you so much for coming to me and let's get you support. Like, what is the next step so that we can be in this together? And I know that there is a process here to help you improve your mood or whatever it is I was struggling with. And so having clarity as a teen of like, what is your ask?
Yeah.
Even if it's just for them to listen. And I think about like the age old back and forth with teens and parents where a teen goes to the parent and the parent is like just solving the problem immediately. And most of the time that's not what you want, but sometimes you might want a solution or you might want their insight.
Right.
So just getting clear on even what is your goal can be really helpful to leave that conversation and be like, okay, that went well and I'm happy with how I showed up and I got my needs met.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. I love that. And we can even communicate that if once we know it, we can communicate that, ahead of the conversation. Say, well, I'm about to tell you how I feel, not for you to fix it, but for you to listen, right?
Yeah.
And that gives also the receiver, okay, I know what I need to do here, right? So we get that feedback, which is great for us to say, okay, I don't need to get my let's fix it mode.
Yeah.
And I can actually hear, right, what's going on. And especially that happens a lot with dads.
Yeah.
We tend to want to solve things, right? And sometimes we are not great listeners.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be really tough. And I think another thing that really comes to mind with the different challenges you mentioned was how isolating each of those feel. And yet you're saying that there's so many people that are bringing
Mm.
up those challenges. Like I remember being like, well, no one understands how difficult my parents are or how annoying it is to talk to them, or no one really understands how stressed I am, or I'm really depressed and no one can relate to that. And yet a lot of those emotions and experiences are really universal, and it's about being vulnerable, speaking about what's going on, and then either getting support or even just getting validation can be incredibly
Yeah.
powerful when you're struggling.
Absolutely. And my TikToks, usually are about expressing something. It's not talking down and explaining and imposing
Yeah.
myself. It's, this is something. And people relate to it and say, yeah, I've been there, I've done that. Well, I thought it was only me that was having those feelings, right?
Yeah.
So just seeing other people struggle with the same things that you struggle, that's in itself is therapeutic.
Yeah, it really is. It's incredible. Today's episode is brought to you by Teen Counseling. You guys know whenever I have a therapist or talk about therapy on the podcast, I like to direct you towards a resource to find a therapist. As we talked about in this episode, there can be a lot of barriers to finding a therapist. I remember in my own experience going to a pediatrician, finding referrals, being on waiting lists, doing intake appointments. It can be a really challenging process to find a therapist that works for you. And so that's why I wanted to share Teen Counseling with you. It is BetterHelp's branch of online therapy specifically for teenagers. There are over 14,000 licensed therapists within their network, and they offer support on things like depression, anxiety, relationships, trauma, and so much more. And they also offer text, talk, and video counseling. So depending on what level of support you're looking for, what type of resource you need, they're able to meet you where you're at. And it's all done from your home. So it's a very accessible option. So if you are interested, you can head to teencounseling.com/shepersisted. You're going to fill out a quick survey about what you're hoping to work on in therapy, what your background is, what it is that you really want to talk to your therapist about. And based on this, they will match you with a therapist. So maybe you want to focus on relationships. They'll match you with a therapist that specializes in relationships. Maybe you're struggling with anxiety. They'll match you with a therapist that specializes in anxiety, etc. So you're going to fill that out. If you're a teen, you do need to put in a parent's email for permission and consent for treatment. I did it. I sent the email to myself. It's super vague. It just says Sadie or whatever your name is wants to work with a therapist from Teen Counseling. None of your information that you put in the survey is given to your parents. Like we talked about in this episode, HIPAA is very much intact, and I know that can be a concern when you're starting therapy as a teen. So same thing works for Teen Counseling. This is your therapist, and that is protected even when you get consent for treatment. So if you want to check out Teen Counseling, the website is teencounseling.com/shepersisted, and the link will be in the show notes. I would love to, speaking of TikTok, get your thoughts on the TikTok mental health space, because over the years it's become a really big corner of the internet, and I would love to kind of hear what your thoughts are, whether it is really great to learn tips and feel that message of other people also are struggling with what I'm struggling with. Are you also seeing that it can kind of be like a substitute for people to say, okay, well, my mental health maybe isn't as bad as that person I saw on TikTok, so I must not need to reach out, or things like that? What are your kind of thoughts of
Yeah.
people being so open and so vulnerable, and also just having an algorithm that brings that content directly to you?
Yeah. So it's tricky, right? Because it can be a great thing and it could be something quite negative.
Yeah.
So it's all based on, okay, what is the message? Who is delivering it? What am I doing with that message that I hear through TikTok? Am I taking action if I see that I reflect, and see that that's actually happening with me? There's a lot of people with good intentions that are giving bad advice.
Yeah.
And that's of course not great, right? And of course TikTok doesn't replace talking to a therapist or seeing your doctor or anything like that, right? So as long as we use it knowing that, okay, that there's some people that know their stuff, they have degrees, they have licenses, and maybe we can use that to get an idea of a diagnosis, an illness or whatever. then it's fine, right?
Yeah.
Once we think that we understand, and we can solve it ourselves, well, maybe not so much, right?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I think of that like bell curve where it's like when you learn a new, or maybe it's a downward slope, but it's when you're learning a new skill and the little tiny bit that you know about it, you think you're like a master of the subject, and the more
Mhm.
you learn, the less you are aware that you know. And I feel
Yeah,
like TikTok can be that way in a lot of senses, and I think that can be true for mental health as well. When you're getting these videos, you're like, this is my diagnosis. This person says this is what I
right.
should do about it. And you kind of lose that step of like, okay, let me go to a doctor and let me get a consult and an
Right.
intake meeting and then go through that whole
Yeah.
process. But yeah, I think about the content I was seeking out when I was struggling. And it again was that looking for that you're not alone, validation,
Yeah.
this is a normal experience. And I just know if I'd found your page, especially with things with family dynamics and experiencing mental health challenges as a teen and how that shows
Yeah.
up in things like cleaning your room or showing up to class, it just would have been a complete game changer, because having that positivity and not just focusing on those really negative thoughts and
Yeah.
emotions, but also focusing on what you can do about it and what you can
Right.
do instead is so powerful.
Right. One of the things that, I love the most, as you know, there's plenty of theories, right? We don't
Yeah.
have one theory that explains all when it comes to counseling and psychology. There's William Glasser. I don't know if you've read him or not, but
Mm-mm.
he is the creator of choice theory. And
Okay, yes.
so, yeah, so he had, what he called total behavior. And for him, total behavior were four things: behaviors, actions, thoughts, our feelings, and our physiological reactions. And he said, imagine the four wheels of the car. The back two wheels are our feelings and our physiological reactions. We don't have direct control over those two wheels, but those two wheels will have to follow the front wheels. And the front wheels are your behaviors and your thoughts. Those we actually can control. And whatever we turn those two to, the back wheels will follow, right? So
Yeah.
if we are stuck in thinking about how we feel, well, we're going to make that feeling even bigger, right?
Yeah.
If we focus on, okay, what can I do? Or how can I challenge a thought that perhaps is not based on reality, is based on a past trauma, or is based on something that I've heard somewhere, right? How can I challenge that thought to make it more real, to make it more based on data? Those are the two things that we have under our control and what we should be focusing on.
Oh, I love that so much. I've never heard that metaphor, but
Mm,
it's amazing. It's phenomenal. And it's so true. I remember I spent years before I was truly like in therapy and learning the skills, just trying to avoid my emotions and control what I was experiencing. And as a result, like pushing away the thoughts, and then they were coming back in a much more intense
yeah,
way. And once you learn that shifting those behaviors and thoughts can actually have a huge impact on the really distressing physical symptoms of anxiety and
right,
depression, and also just the overwhelming feelings, it's so empowering to know that you
yeah,
do have control, because that's one of the biggest things that I feel people with mental health challenges voice is they're like, I just don't have control. I can't control my mental health. I can't solve anything. It's just that overwhelming
yeah,
experience. So I love that metaphor.
yeah. And there's the good and the bad of
Hmm.
these things, right? And the bad is that some people tell me, well, my problems are not real, right? That person has problems. I'm
Yeah.
I'm just depressed. And I'm like, if I could have a broken bone in my body or depression, I
Hmm.
would choose to have a broken bone. You know why? Because I know what it is. I know how to fix it. It's only going to hurt sometimes, but when you are depressed, your feelings have been altered, your behaviors have been altered, your thoughts have been altered. So your whole being is being affected by the depression. So it's
Yeah.
not just your lower leg, it's everything that you do and feel and think.
Yeah.
So it is much larger. Now, the good news is that, for instance, depression and anxiety, the, the prognostics is great. People get better, right?
Yeah.
So that's the silver lining in all of this.
Yeah, I love that. And it also makes me think of something that I learned in class this week, but we were talking about how there was this shift from thinking about psychology as treatment of existing problems
Mm-hmm.
to accepting your life as it is and almost working to improve it, and not just
Mm-hmm.
problem solving the issues that already exist, but allowing yourself to perform at a higher level or feel better long term, even if there's not necessarily a diagnosis. And I
Right.
feel like we have that disconnect still due to mental health stigma when it comes to therapy. A lot of the times it's like, okay, I'm going to go to therapy because I have anxiety or I'm depressed or I'm having challenges in a relationship. But there's also this whole other side of it, like you were talking about, where you have the ability to equip yourself with skills. You can better navigate challenges, improve your overall mood, and just
Mm-hmm.
feel better about your life. And I don't
Yeah.
think that approach is necessarily yet widely accepted. And like we talked about at the beginning of this episode, not even readily available based on the resources that exist.
Yeah. And problems, may have brought you to where you are.
Yeah.
Now, the solution is in the present, is not in the past. So, yes, that might have caused what's happening today, but we need to change our thoughts and behaviors today in order to feel different, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the key. The key is, of course, always in the now. One of my favorite phrases in psychology is history is not destiny.
I love that.
And I don't have any tattoos, but if I would have one, probably that would be part of it, right?
Yeah.
Because no matter what has happened to this day in your life, that doesn't, tell you where your life is going to go. So it's not like we used to believe that, Freud thought that the first 5 years were determinant of everything in your life,
Yeah.
right? Well, yeah, not quite. So we always have a choice. We always have that option in front of us that can be an inflection point in our lives. And especially when we're going through a crisis. A crisis is an opportunity. A crisis
Yeah.
is that time that we reevaluate things and behave differently, right? So if I
Absolutely.
if I look back at my life, probably my best decisions came out of a crisis, right?
Yeah.
And in the moment, who wants to be in crisis? No
Yeah.
one. But sometimes it is necessary to have that crisis to actually realize, hey, this is not working. I need to do something different.
For teens who are hearing that and they're like, I'm in crisis, I'm at rock bottom, but I do want to make those changes. And now is the chance when I can really make a difference on this trajectory that I'm on. What is your advice or some wisdom that you have from seeing so many patients being at that starting point and also having so much experience helping people navigate that
Yeah.
process? What would you say to a teen who is currently in that stage one, step one,
Yeah.
about to do this entire journey?
Well, so there's different levels of difficulties, right? If you are rock bottom and you have trouble getting out of bed, well, certainly seek help, right? Because it's going to be harder to turn it around on your own.
Yeah.
If you are closer to the surface and you're feeling like, yeah, I'm pushing through, but I'm not enjoying things and kind of starting to isolate somehow, and you see all of those signs, then we can try things on our own, right? One of the things is the fake it until you make it effect, because again, connected to what we said earlier, you are behaving differently, so
Yeah.
that will have an effect on your feelings, right? And we might not feel like doing something, but when we do it, well, actually, that felt great, right? So, so who feels like going on a run? Well, probably no
Literally.
one, right? But you go on a run, you push yourself, and your body doesn't care if you want it to run or not. Your body will react to what happened, and you run, and your brain is creating more serotonin, and you feel happier. So sometimes it's that fake it until you make it that can be great.
Yeah.
That's one tip.
I love that. I've never thought about that before, that like your body literally does not care the reason why you
Yeah.
did something. It will react to the final like destination and behavior itself, whether it's getting out of bed or getting ready for the day. going to class, going to exercise, spending time with a friend. I think that's huge, and it can be really helpful to overcome that mental hump of like, I don't want to do this, but I know it will be good for me.
Right, right. And exercise is one of those things that,
Yeah.
you can always count on, right? Or doing something like, meditating or doing some breathing exercises when you are feeling anxious. Even do some yoga poses, right? Anything that will get us from being up here to being in our bodies,
Yeah.
right? Anything that will stop that ruminating, behavior and make you be in the
Mm-hmm.
moment and say, okay, I'm here. I'm here right now, and this is what's outside. And we take that cognitive focus on the problem, and we focus on the here and now, and we break that pattern of thinking negatively.
Yeah, absolutely. For listeners that are tuning into this episode, obviously you share so much wisdom and insight on social media and to your community. If there was one piece of advice or wisdom that you could impart in every teen who is struggling with their mental health or who might struggle with their mental health at some time, what would that be?
I would say that, it gets better.
Yeah.
I would say that probably if you ask any 30 something or 40 something, 50 something, and you tell them, would you go back to your teenage years? They would say, no
No.
way. No
Yeah.
way. There's no amount of money you can pay me to go back to those years because it's confusing, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to develop your own identity. Your brain is making all these kinds of connections. Your amygdala is fully developed, but yet your frontal lobe is not. So you have all the emotions, but you don't
Mm-hmm.
have a way to control them fully yet.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot happening physiologically. There's a lot happening socially. Sometimes we don't fully know what we want, and,
Mm-hmm.
and we become desperate because of that. And,
Yeah.
I didn't know what I wanted when I was a teenager, and that came later in life. And sometimes we have to be patient and say, well, I may not know what I want today out of life, but I know it'll come. So
Yeah.
maybe I need to focus on something different right now. So, you know, life is dynamic. Life is never static. So the way we feel today is not necessarily the way that we will feel tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And once you realize that, okay, this is here, but it's not here to stay. And the easiest way to see that and look at the data is there was a time in my life that I wasn't feeling depressed or anxious.
Yeah.
Therefore, I wasn't born with that.
Mm-hmm.
Then, as a consequence, this is going to go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for somebody that is suffering through depression or anxiety, and you feel so overwhelmed that you assume that, okay, this is it. This is the way I'm going to feel for the rest of my life. I think it's important to hear that this is temporary.
Mm-hmm.
You did
Mm-hmm.
not feel the way, maybe 6 months, a year, 2 years ago. Well, you will not feel this way in the near future.
Yeah. I love that. And I think it is really helpful context to have when you are feeling so hopeless because it can be so all consuming to be in that headspace and have those emotions come up. And so to put things in that perspective and know that you've done it before and you can do it again
Yeah.
and that nothing is permanent, especially emotions and thoughts. And so it is extremely possible and it will happen that these things will shift and fade with time. And you have so much power to make those choices and engage in those behaviors and rewire those thoughts and really turn things around.
Absolutely, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
I always think in an optimist way. I'm very hopeful. I wasn't always like this. I was, growing up, I was very much a pessimist, but I work hard to see the positive, and
Yeah.
and the positive is out there, right? And you see the younger generations breaking out stigmas and discussing things and wanting different, wanting more, right? We don't want to, live to work. We want to
Yeah.
work to live. So, there's a lot of changes that are coming that you guys are pushing that, I love that.
Me too. If people want to follow along on social media or check out your website, potentially work with you, where can they do that?
Yeah, so if you can spell my name, which is kind of complicated, you can just Google me and you'll see my website. And I'm not as active in every platform, but just find me, send me a text, send me an email, a message. I'll be happy to reply if I can. Anything that I can do to help others is what I'm here for, right?
Yeah.
My daughter, a couple of years ago, she said, Dad, how can you sit down and listen to problems all day long?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I love what I do. Somebody's got to be there. Somebody has to help. And when you see someone that is, flourishing and coming out of that state that they came in, it's a great feeling to have.
I love that. It's incredibly true, and especially for so many that feel like therapy or treatment is a last resort and they've tried everything, to have someone there that just really wants to listen and is truly so
Yeah.
passionate about helping them is just an amazing thing to know and be aware of. And I'm sure it gives so many listeners so much hope if they're going to their first therapy appointment or starting with a new therapist or
Yeah.
whatever it is.
And if you guys, go to your first therapy appointment and you don't quite click with a therapist, it is okay to see two, three, four, five therapists,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
shop around. So you have to feel that connection with a
Mm-hmm.
therapist. That's key in order to make progress. So make
100%.
sure that you date around a little bit.
100%. It's a process. I remember hearing one time in one of my classes that it on average takes individuals 6 or 7 different clinicians before they
Hmm.
finally find one that works and they truly see a shift in their mental health. And I was like, that really sucks, but it's so true. I remember that in my own experience. And so you will find the individual that's really helpful, and you will find the type of therapy or the type of treatment
Yeah.
and that relationship that is really helpful in supporting you there.
And in this and in basically in anything in life, as long as we don't give up, you
Mm-hmm.
will find a solution, right?
Yeah.
So that's just the way it goes. And I talk about this when I work with couples, and as long as we're both willing to engage and try, we'll make it work. And as long as we want to get to a place that we know we're not there yet, but we don't give up, then you'll get there, right? It might take a
Yeah.
longer route, but you'll get there.
Ugh, I absolutely love that, and it's so true. If you don't give up, you will find the solution, and it's just about committing to that and making that decision and continuing forward. And I think it can be really hard sometimes. It can be really hard to make that commitment, but it's
Yeah.
also it's very true what you're saying.
Life can be hard, right?
Yeah.
Life can be difficult. Anybody's going to experience difficulties in life, and I think those that actually end up thriving, it is because they've experienced significant things in their past, and they dealt with them,
Hmm.
and they came out with more wisdom because of it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think that going through difficulties also make you more conscientious and more empathetic and more aware of what's actually out there.
Yeah, it's also very encouraging to remember that the majority of humans will thrive and will
Hmm.
overcome a challenge and will overcome a trauma. It's the minority that end up getting stuck in that position or having really extreme mental health challenges. And I was in the minority, many people are. But humans by nature are meant to overcome and are meant to persist and be really resilient. So it's in your nature and it's very possible, and you're not working against yourself to try and reach recovery and try and make those positive
Yeah,
changes.
yeah, we definitely are resilient, and it's not how many times we fall, but how many times we get up and keep going.
Yes. Yes, I love that. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure. I loved this conversation. I have so many new quotes that I'm going to be writing down and living by. And I know that so many people listening are feeling the exact same way. So thank you so much for being here today and for coming on She Persisted.
No, absolutely, this was a great conversation. We should do it again.
Yes, I would love to. I would absolutely love to. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of She Persisted. If you enjoyed, make sure to share with a friend or family member. It really helps out the podcast. And if you haven't already, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also make sure to follow along at She Persisted Podcast on both Instagram and TikTok, and check out all the bonus resources, content, and information on my website, shepersistedpodcast.com. Thanks for supporting, keep persisting, and I'll see you next week.